Hello and welcome to Bottom of the Bottle. Today is going to be a Mastercrafted episode, the first one. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing on one of America's treasured, oldest, and outstanding distilleries, Wild Turkey. Hope you enjoy. All right. Welcome. It is 7:20 in the morning, 2/27/2020, and welcome to a Mastercrafted episode. These Mastercrafted videos I am making are going to be me focusing on very specific distillers, distilleries, their products, and the history behind everything that they do. Some of these are very important to the history of at least American whiskey. In today's episode, we'll be talking about Wild Turkey. And if you don't know who Wild Turkey is, I do hope you feel like you somewhat know who they are after everything is said and done today. But there's just some stuff I really want to geek over about. So that's what these Mastercrafted videos are going to be. Some of this stuff is going to be on it's going to be on people you most likely know, in forms of if you're a very consistent whiskey consumer and drinker enthusiast, you'll know who these guys are. But to the average Joe, you'll probably have no idea. And hopefully now next time you go to order a drink, you kind of know at least what's going to be in your drink, more so now. But today's episode is on Wild Turkey, and I felt that I couldn't really talk about American bourbon at all until I first talked about Wild Turkey. Wild Turkey, the master distillers behind Wild Turkey, both Jimmy and Eddie Russell, masters in the field, complete masters. It's Jimmy Russell's known as the master distiller's master distiller, or the Buddha of bourbon, and his son Eddie Russell is slowly climbing up to be probably going to be one of the best distillers that ever lived. But before I just start going nuts on all the distillers and all that, first we got to talk a little bit about history with Wild Turkey. All right. The spirit we know as Wild Turkey today started in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky in 1869 by the Ripley family. The Ripley family are two brothers. The main one that I don't have their names up here. One thing interesting about Wild Turkey is that it was started by the Ripley family back in, again, 1869. But it did not get its name, Wild Turkey, until 1940, when one of the executives of Austin Nicholas, who was a wholesaler and distributor at the time, who was very popular, who would buy the whiskey that the Ripley family were making and bottle it. He actually, one of his executives, coined the name when they were going on a wild turkey hunting trip, and he brought a lot of the bourbon that the Ripley family was making, and it just got really popular with the family, and a lot of people were wondering hey, did you bring that Wild Turkey bourbon? And after that, the name just kind of stuck. It's that's interesting, because there is a story behind every bottle, but just a basic story like that created just a very, I don't know, the name kind of fits. I don't know how the bourbon is, it just fits. But after that, Austin Nicholas and one of his stores just started buying the whiskey from the Ripley family and bottling it and selling it under a Wild Turkey label. Now, I quickly pulled up the names, because I forgot them, and I apologize for that, of the Ripley brothers, both John and James Ripley, who came over from Tyrone, Ireland, came over to Kentucky to start making bourbon. And again, that's how most of this stuff kind of started in the U.S. A lot of our stuff, it was just a lot of Irish and Scottish settlers that came over. And the business was doing great for a while, and Austin Nicholas got more involved in it, started helping them produce, got them a distillery on Wild Turkey Hill, which was this area which had this limestone fall. Limestone helps bring iron out of water to make it more usable. Water is used in whiskey through 100% of the process. Every process involves water, but you need very clean water. And there's this area where it's called Wild Turkey Hill now, but it was this limestone water area where a lot of the water would just be pulled through the limestone. It would take out all the iron and impurities that would make whiskey bad and bitter and all that. And the business was doing great until the dreaded 1919. Now, if you don't know what happened in 1919, you should. Prohibition. Prohibition happened, and a lot of distillers around the United States, especially in Kentucky, closed down, and most of them would never reopen. But Wild Turkey was one of the ones that stayed strong because though you couldn't really produce alcohol anymore, you could produce alcohol for medical purposes. And that's how, for the most part, they stayed afloat. They produced moderate production of medical uses. They sold this to Austin Nicholas, who then sold it out of his several stores up until 1933, when in 1933, Prohibition was repealed, and the U.S. no longer became a dry country, even though it really wasn't. I mean, when we look at Prohibition, it was one of the most. I always find it funny that the Prohibition was called the Noble Experiment, yet it was also probably the most corrupted era, or one of the most corrupted eras in U.S. history. It's so fucked up. Oh, all right. Let me get a little bit of coffee. I'm choking on my own saliva. Oh, all right. Brief history on there. Back most recent in 2009, they were bought by the Compari Group, the Compari Beverage Group. Compari is an Italian beverage company. You could even see one of their main drinks that they make, their crown jewel, Compari. It's a very sweet thing, very sweet, also kind of bitter liqueur. It's Italian. Italy loves it, and I like it in some cocktails, but not by itself. I do find it very good. However, though, probably one of the most important events in Wild Turkey history is in 1954. One of the people that started from the bottom, he started sweeping floors, started managing the warehouse, started doing all this stuff. But in 1954, Jimmy Russell became one of the 3 distillers to pop up and actually start working with Master Distiller Bill Hughes and Ernest W. Ripley, who was one of the sons of the original distillers, which is pretty cool. Let me get back to my thing. Now, Jimmy Russell, who is still working at the distillery to this day, he's 90-something years old, has 60 years of experience under his belt. I mean, the man is a legend when it comes to bourbon. As I said, he is known as the master distiller, or the Booba of bourbon among his peers. He's in the Kentucky Hall of Fame, Distiller Hall of Fame, the creator of one of the first premium bourbons, which I do own one of them, or one of the most recent editions of them, which is a rare breed. I also own a Master's Keep. He's also creator of Kentucky Spirit Single Barrel and the co-creator with his son, which is the Russell Reserve. You can see it. It's made by Wild Turkey, though it doesn't say Wild Turkey on the bottle. It's called Russell Reserve. It's the stuff that both Jimmy and Eddie are like really, it's stuff they kind of save for a while, and it's some really good stuff. They make a 6-year Russell Reserve 6-year rye is one of my favorites. But that is co-created with him. Russell Reserve products are co-created with him and his son, as well as they are both equally the creators of the Master's Keep, which is another. It's about as when Wild Turkey goes. Besides Wild Turkey Diamond, which was this 60-year-old. It wasn't 60, but it was the anniversary of Wild Turkey Diamond was the anniversary of Jimmy Russell's 60 years at the distillery, and that I'm pretty sure is a mixture of 16 and 18-year-old bourbon. And the reason why they have those on hand is Wild Turkey Master's Keep, which is another high end. And compared to other bottles, like there's the Whistle Pig Boss Hog, which I see on retail anywhere between like $300 and $500. A Master's Keep, which I do own one, and it's one of the more high-end, very premium brands of bourbon. It's $160 compared to, and that's still a lot to pay for bourbon, but compared to Boss Hog, which I've tried Boss Hog, and it's good stuff, but I wouldn't say it compares to a rare breed, which is a $50 bottle. Still, for the most part, it's still good stuff. Wild Turkey, Jimmy Russell was also coined for creating one of the first flavored bourbons. In 1976, Created one of the first flavored bourbons that was known as Wild Turkey Bourbon Liqueur, which now is known as American Honey. And then Eddie Russell even did a little bit of a twist on that, called American Honey Sting, which is also very good. I'm not a very big person on flavored bourbons, but I do like the American Honey from a Wild Turkey. I do like it. It's very appropriate in some cocktails, like maple old fashions, and because in a maple old fashioned, you're generally supposed to use maple syrup and Canadian whiskey, but that honey whiskey is really good with it too. It's a little much, but it's also fucking delicious. Jimmy was granted the lifetime honorary membership to the Kentucky Distillers Association Board of Directors, which is an honor bestowed on only 5 other distillers, which is insane. And the organization has been around for 134 years. He's also, he was on the wine and spirits competition, which goes on in Kentucky. It's a very big convention. He's one of the main tasters and all that. But just talk about that. Like, Wild Turkey has been making bourbon the same way before Prohibition because of people like Jimmy Russell. He's been keeping the family. He's been keeping the bourbon, it's the way it's supposed to be made, as he states. I'll put the link in the description. There's his bio, but there's also if you have 20 minutes to spare, there's an excellent it's a small 15-minute documentary on the man behind the bourbon, Jimmy Russell. I would highly recommend the watch. It's a great video, absolutely fantastic. Because he's a master in this field. He's been making bourbon the same way it should have been made before Prohibition. He still does, like, they don't do, they use char oak barrels. American white oak barrels are used to mainly store bourbon. They do other things like wine casks and port casks and a few others, but for the most part, it's bourbon, it's white oak charred barrels. And each company does a variation. There's 4 different types of char. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each 4 is the max char, like the deepest char you can get in a barrel. And Wild Turkey, for every single one of the products, does a number 4 char, otherwise known as an alligator char. It's something that they do very much. That's more about the craft. I actually have a section right in front of me here simply on the craft, and we'll get to that here in a second. Let's talk about the second veteran of Wild Turkey, who's been working there for 34 years, is Eddie Russell's son, Jimmy Russell's son, Eddie Russell. Eddie Russell has 34 years of experience under his belt. He is a part of the Kentucky Distiller Hall of Fame, and he's doing some really cool stuff too. He's been doing a lot of good stuff with ryes. I know Jimmy Russell isn't a big fan of ryes, but Eddie likes ryes a bit more than Jimmy, and I do too. I mean, ryes are really, the rye market in the United States is really being saturated right now. But there's a lot of good ryes coming out. There's a lot of bad, but there's a lot. I mean, not bad. They're just not that interesting. But there's a lot of good ones too. He's the second veteran. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame by his father, Jimmy Russell. He's the co-creator of the Russell Reserves and the Master Keep, as I said, but he's also has some other things that he's pretty much done by himself. The Master Keep's Cornerstone Rye, which is a premium rye, $160. It's one of the Master Keeps, because the Master Keep was always bourbons and specialty made bourbons, but this was the first Master Keep's rye, and Eddie was the main one pushing that for a while. It's $160 retail, and I did try it, just like 0.50 of an ounce at one of my bars in town, and it is spicy. It is good stuff. It's one of the first bourbons I can say you can't mix that in anything. I mean, you can if you want to make a very expensive cocktail, but I would not. It's one of those bourbons that's like a scotch that you just can't really mix with stuff. It's really good. Not saying that some scotches can't be good in cocktails. There are some scotches that are really good in cocktails and they're fairly high end, but for the most part, it's not appropriate, I guess I would say. I mean, I don't know what I'm saying. Another thing that also Eddie Russell's son, which is Bruce Russell, he's a really big rye fan, and he's currently working at the distillery right now. I don't know if he's working as a distiller at the moment, but I do know he's moving up, and he's probably going to take over once Eddie starts backing out of his role as master distiller, because Jimmy is still working there. What is it, 60 years? 60 plus 60 years. So I know he's not that much involved anymore. So who's next? It's going to be Eddie. Eddie's now the master distiller and mainly controls everything that goes on at the distillery. Then after him, it's Bruce. Bruce will be the next one to go up. And he's a big rye guy, so we'll see how that goes in the next 20 years. 10 to 20 years. Alright, and now we need to talk about the craft. The craft is what makes this bourbon appropriate. They've been crafting it the same way since before Prohibition, as I've said I don't know how many times through this recording. But Wild Turkey cuts no corners when it comes to making their signature bourbon. Still to this day, they use the original yeast strain that is a propriety of Wild Turkey, but they still use the same yeast strain that they've had that many years ago. It's the same exact strain that they use in every single one of their mash bills. Their mash bills are primarily heavy corn and high rye, so it's at least, what's their corn? I actually have a book right here, so maybe if I could find it real quick. A mash bill, as I'm trying to find this, a mash bill is basically the mixture of the grains that they use to create the bourbon. I know Wild Turkey's mash bill. I have a thing right here of all the mash bills. It's generally 75% corn, 13% rye, 12% barley, for the most part, in Wild Turkey 101, 81, Diamond. So they use a obviously high corn and high rye. Using 13% rye doesn't sound like a lot, but in a corn where you're not going, like, they don't even use wheat, so it's primarily corn and rye and barley, and it's got this very amber, spicy, vanilla taste. I don't even know. I gotta try some in front of me. I'll try some here in a bit, which will probably be my first tasting video after this goes up. I'll do a taste on, I'll showcase some of the Wild Turkey bourbons, but I'll do a taste on like a rare breed, which is a mixture of 6, 8, and 12-year bourbons. Anyways, they use water that is naturally filtered through limestone that comes from the Kentucky River, since they're very close. Great. They use non-GMO corn and other grains. They do not use anything less. They could use the finest product. They age stuff in new oak barrels with a number 4 char, otherwise known as an alligator char, on the barrel. No exception there. To get that signature bold color and flavor, they have to use that number 4 char, and they use it on every single one of their bourbons, even stuff like American Honey. They use that number 4 char. The minimum, so the bourbon laws for straight bourbon, you might see that on the bottle. It's straight bourbon, straight Kentucky bourbon. What that means, straight bourbon needs to be high corn, at least 51%, and needs to be matured in new oak barrel casks for at least 2 years. But a Wild Turkey does a minimum of 5, and even then they still add another 2 to 3 years on top of that. And they use that for almost every single one of their bourbons. So and Wild Turkey is fairly inexpensive for, let's just go over some of their products. We have Wild Turkey 81 proof, Wild Turkey Rye 81 proof, Wild Turkey 101, Wild Turkey 101 Rye. All this stuff, if you want to get a massive bottle of it, it's that might be a bit hard, but to get just a basic bottle of Wild Turkey 101, it's $18. So after this, if you're craving some bourbon, I would recommend go getting some Wild Turkey 101. Even though I would say it's a good sipping bourbon. Even though some people might disagree, it's a great cocktail bourbon. But I could sip some Wild Turkey 101 straight, no issue. A little bit on all the products that Wild Turkey produces, and they do produce a lot. As again, Wild Turkey and Wild Turkey Rye 81 proof, Wild Turkey 101 and 101 Rye. That proof, 101 is 50% alcohol, 81 is 41% alcohol. They make Wild Turkey Rare Breed, which is a mixture of 6, 8, and 12 year. They make Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit, a single barrel at 101 proof. They do Russell Reserve 10 year, Russell Reserve 6 year, Russell Reserve single barrel, Russell Reserve single barrel 110 proof. Wild Turkey Long Branch, which is the bourbon they made in, they made it with Matthew McConaughey. It's their new one, their new advertisement campaign with McConaughey. They do the Master's Keep, those are generally aged for anywhere between like 12 and 17 years. I do have the Master's Keep Revival, It's one of the ones that I have. There's also a Master's Keep Decades and a Cornerstone. Those are one of my favorites. And that's all they produce. Yeah. If I were to recommend any one of these, for more bang with your buck, if you could get your hands on it, because in some areas, I do know there's a few places with just a few bottles left on the shelf. But anyone who's a really good bourbon aficionado, they will tell you that Wild Turkey Rare Breed is something that you got to get a hold of. It's a $50 bottle, I think, or it might be a $45 bottle. But if you could get your hands on it, I would highly recommend it. It is good stuff. Also flavored American Honey and American Honey Sting. The biggest consumers outside of Wild Turkey, outside of the U.S., weirdly enough, because I do know Jimmy and Eddie go to these countries a lot to showcase their bourbon, is Japan and Australia. Japan and Australia is some of our biggest we export a lot of Wild Turkey to them. They really love it out there. Some of my personal thoughts on the matter. Again, we're reaching towards the end. I talked briefly about the history. I talked about the masters. I talked about the craft, their products. I'll do a tasting video sometime after this, but personal thoughts, man, I love Wild Turkey. It was one of my first experiences with Wild Turkey. The first experience I've ever had with whiskey, which I didn't drink until I was 21. And when I was 21, I went to a local place in town, a gastropub, one of those very nice fancy places. And they made me a cedar smoked old fashioned with Woodford Reserve. Again, Kentucky bourbon. Woodford Reserve is probably, I think they own the oldest distillery. Not that Woodford Reserve is one of the oldest, but they do have their building, I think, is the oldest out of all the distilleries in Kentucky, and they make some pretty good stuff too. Well, Woodford Reserve, I don't know if I'll ever do a Mastercrafted video on it, but they do make some pretty good stuff. I might just do a Mastercrafted on Kentucky Row, which is the 10 or 12. All 10 or 12 of those distilleries live fairly close to each other in Kentucky, so I might just do a Mastercrafted video on all of Kentucky, because it's the bourbon capital of the world. I'm pretty sure, what is it, like 85% of all whiskey that's made in the United States comes out of Kentucky. It might even be 90%. It's somewhere in between 80 and 90% of all the whiskey that is made in the United States comes out of Kentucky. That's a lot of whiskey. The quality for the price is so hard to beat out of Wild Turkey, because there's a lot of premium bourbon. So another thing that Scotland is doing like a lot of crazy stuff, because Scotch just became the most expensive liqueur in the world. It passed cognac. Cognac was at one point the most expensive and like highly produced liqueur in the world. Now it's Scotch. Scotch has surpassed that tenfold. We're seeing Scotch makers making $100,000 bottle of scotches. I'm pretty sure one bottle of Scotch, I forget what bottle it was like a 35-year edition or a 64-year edition of some really rare stuff, sold for $1.2 million at auctions. Now this stuff isn't one of my favorite people, and I have his book downstairs. I forgot his name, but he created 101 whiskeys to try before you die. And he says that bourbons like this aren't necessarily the best. They don't necessarily taste amazing compared to some other stuff, but they do. It's novelty. Most of this stuff was like that bourbon that was sold for $1.2 million. I'm pretty sure it was donated to an auction and then donated to a charity. It's for events and all specialty stuff. And we're starting to see that with bourbons. I mean, Boss Hogg is like a $500 bottle of bourbon. Whistle Pig. We're seeing Booker's, rare Booker's. I'm pretty sure the rare, Wild Turkey has one. The Wild Turkey Diamond, plus 60 years. That's very rare. And there's a place in town that actually has a bottle of it. They're about an hour and a half away from me, but they have a bottle. 2 ounces is 2 ounces, which is just neat. It's a normal glass, 2-ounce glass of that Wild Turkey Diamond. I'm pretty sure is like $64. Just for a glass, not for the bottle, for a fucking glass, which is, I haven't tried it. Spending $64 on a glass of bourbon is dangerous. But, yeah, I would highly recommend. So I'm going to put a few links in the bottom to Wild Turkey, the Wikipedia, one of the history pages by the Compari Group. I'll send a link to that if you want to read about it. I would highly recommend, because I'm going to do it in the description, a YouTube video on the man behind the bourbon, Jimmy Russell. It's produced by the Wild Turkey Distillery. It's a 15-minute video. Please, I would highly recommend the watch if you have 20 minutes to spare, because it's a really good video. It shows you about the bourbon, shows you about the history, the family, the commitment, the craft. It's a beautiful thing. I would highly recommend you go check it out. Anyways, this was obviously this is going to be somewhat of a mess for my first video of Mastercrafted. This is my third video that I've ever produced, but I'm hoping to slowly just get into the groove of things. I want to do, my next video is probably going to be a tasting video, and that will be up when it's up. Anyways, hope you enjoyed, and cheers.